Today on Block Study, we're going to be tackling some truly tiny triangles. Welcome back to another block study. This is the third in a series of these videos, and there's an introduction video. If you haven't seen that, then you might want to take a few minutes. I'll put the link in the description along just to the general playlist of this series. This week we have a block called Grandmother's Favorite, which is a truly terrible name for a cool block. It's kind of generic, it doesn't tell you anything about the block, and it's such a common name for a block that I really couldn't find out any information about this actual block. So I tried Googling it and looking it up, and there were many Grandmother's Favorites blocks, but none of them looked like this. So this block has a lot of triangle elements in it, and those triangles come in kind of two flavors. We're going to be dealing with half square triangles as well as quarter square triangles. The difference between those two triangles really boils down to where the bias lies on that triangle. A half square triangle, you're cutting a square from diagonal to diagonal, which means that the bias is going to run along the long side of the triangle, the hypotenuse, if you will. On a quarter square triangle, you are cutting a square on the diagonal both directions. So the bias is going to be on the two shorter sides of the triangle. So why does bias matter? Ultimately, it comes down to the stability of your block. If your warp and weft of your fabric is all running in the same direction in your block, then your block is going to wear a little bit better. It's not going to stretch out of shape. It's just going to give like an overall kind of better appearance to your block. And if you're using a print, the print is all going to be either up and down or side to side. Instead of having some on an angle, cutting your pieces consistently to use either a quarter or a half square triangle and mixing them where appropriate will give you that more polished look. So let's jump into the block because I think that this will make more sense as we kind of assemble the block. I've already completed the cut list for this block, and it is a little bit more extensive than some of the other blocks that we have made, but they're all just squares. There's nothing really super crazy. The only thing to really kind of look at is if you are making the fat quarter version, there is one cut that is 6 5/8 of an inch. It's just another line on your ruler though. Like, don't be afraid of those 1/8 inch lines. Almost all rulers have those 1/8 inch markings. And if you need to put a little bit of washi tape on your ruler or something to help you quickly identify that line, then do it. But, it's just another line. You don't have to be afraid. Once you cut it, then it's just a square. And we don't have to worry about that little 1/8 of an inch anymore. So once you cut all your squares, it is time to do the subcutting. Now there are little stars and carrots next to some of the blocks in your cut list, and those are the blocks that we need to subcut into different shapes. But the first thing I want to do is set aside my 4-inch background and my 4-inch print fabric. Those are going to be the half square triangles, so we don't need to do anything to those. The other block we don't need to touch is the big background square. That's going to be the center of your block and doesn't require any subcutting. So now we need to take a background square, and it is time to cut it on the diagonal to create quarter square triangles. And these will eventually be the center of our little side units. So we need to cut this 4.5 inch background square on the diagonal both directions. And I'm just going to line my ruler up corner to corner and make a nice clean cut. And now I'm going to carefully pick up my ruler, and I'm not going to move my fabric at all, but I am going to just rotate my ruler and connect the other two corners. And now we have 4 quarter square triangles. And you want to be a little bit ginger with these. These are those bias edges that we were talking about, and they do have a little bit of stretch to them. Now, I do not usually heavily starch my fabric, but in this case, I did, because we're cutting so much bias into these little pieces, and they are relatively small pieces. So I did starch my fabric, and it's just going to make this process go just a little bit more smoothly. I didn't starch my fabric for the 8-inch square, and while I was sewing it together, I was thinking about how much I wished I had starched it. So it's worth just a couple minutes, especially if you need to press your fabric anyway. If it's, you know, been folded up, then just squirt it with a little bit of starch. So now we're going to cut the 4 3/4 inch print fabric the same way. We're just going to grab this, rotate it, and make another cut. Now I'm cutting all 3 of mine at the same time, but obviously I'm all about what you are most comfortable doing. If you want to cut them one at a time, then definitely do that. And that leaves us with 4 background squares. We are going to cut these just once on the diagonal to create half square triangles. I always like to add in some extra size to as many components of a block as possible so that I can trim them down so that they are nice and perfect, so the final block goes together really well. So these 1/4 square white triangles are the only pieces here that are cut to perfect size. And that's just going to make assembling these side units a lot easier, but there will be some trimming ease worked in on both the print 1/4 square triangles as well as those kind of exterior background half square triangles. So let's return to our little 4-inch squares. Now we've made half square triangles a million times. We are using the 2 at a time method because we just need 4 for our block. And that means we are going to be drawing a diagonal line across our square. And then we are going to sew 1/4 inch on either side of those lines. Now that we've sewn on either side, I'm going to cut these apart by cutting on the diagonal line and then press them open. I usually press all of my seam allowances open, but there are a few places in this block where I won't be. This is not one of them. I will press these open. So now that my half square triangles are pressed, I'm going to go trim them down to 3.5 inches. Now I'm sure it does not seem like taking the time to trim this little tiny bit of fabric off is worthwhile, but it is. Those little tiny bits, those 1/16ths of an inch and 1/8ths of an inch, really add up. And if you're not trimming your half square triangles or your subunits and your blocks are coming out the wrong size, maybe they're too big, maybe your seams aren't lining up, like if you're sewing together a row of blocks and then another row of blocks and then trying to match up those rows and they're not matching up, then trimming could be the culprit. So it's just worth it if you want your blocks to like really match up and you want to preserve all your points, then it's worth just taking a couple minutes and squaring up your subunits. Now that we have our half square triangles done and trimmed, they can be set aside until we're ready to assemble the block. So now it's time to tackle these side units. These are the only tricky bit in this block, and we're going to start with our small background 1/4 square triangle. And we are going to sew it along this long edge to one of our print triangles. Now these are not the same size, as I'm sure you are noticing. The background triangle here is exactly how big it needs to be in the final block, plus 1/4 inch on all sides. The print triangles are sized so that you have some trimming room. So we are going to just kind of center this background triangle on the larger print triangle and sew it together. Right sides together, 1/4 inch seam allowance, nothing fancy. But do be sure to check your seam allowance. If your seam allowance is too big, then you might have a little bit of trouble with these side units. So be sure to check. It only takes a minute. A few tips sewing these together. These are 2 long bias edges, as we've discussed. Starch is going to help you. If you have the kind of machine that kind of sucks points down into it when you're trying to sew, then just sending a little scrap of fabric through first and then sticking your tiny point in there might help prevent that from happening. It's also just taking your time, let the machine feed the fabric through, and don't put any pressure, don't stretch your bias seam as it's trying to take it in. Don't like kind of hold it down so that the machine is pulling it and distorting that triangle. Once we have that seam done, you will have something that looks like this. And now we are going to press it open. And I am going to press the seam allowance open as well. The same tips apply for pressing as they do for sewing. Be sure to press down on your iron. Don't drag it across that seam. Just open it up with your fingers, press down, and then press that seam allowance open if you want to. But I'm done here, and you have this kind of lopsided half square triangle. And I know you want to trim that off, but don't. You can take some scissors and just cut off the dog ears, but resist the urge to trim off this extra bit of print that extends beyond the edge of the background triangle. We're going to use that. So now it is time to sew the kind of base of these triangles on. And if it helps you, then lay this out, because I sewed the triangles on the wrong way. I'm not going to say how many times, but it was more than one. So be sure to just lay it out and make sure it looks like this and not like this or like that. I did that once. You want it to look like this, like the Triforce logo if you're a Nintendo fan. I'm sure someone will get that joke. So now it is time to just sew this together. And again, this print triangle is bigger than the square you're attaching it to. And that's okay. We just want to be sure to line up this edge and this edge. And there will be a tail that sticks out, and that's okay. And here we are to the step where I am going to stop pressing open for a little while. We already have quite a buildup of fabric in this corner, and if we were to open it up and press open, that would be quite a lump. So we're just going to press, since there's no seams on this side, we're just going to press out towards that triangle. And again, press, don't iron, because, again, bias. That's like the word of the day. So I have pressed this out with the seam pointing towards the triangle, and now I'm just going to clip my dog ear off, just to make it a little bit easier for this next step, which is to sew this triangle onto our little unit. And it is the same thing as we did over here. We are going to be folding this right side together, lining up the right angle of the triangle with the corner of the square, and sewing with a 1/4 inch seam. I always like to flip mine so that if there's a solid piece of fabric on one side, I'm sewing with my seam allowances exposed on the top so that I can keep an eye on them. You don't always have that choice. Sometimes there's seam allowances on both sides. But if there's a point I'm trying to preserve or a seam allowance I want to make sure stays open or to one side, then I always sew with that side facing. And now we come to an important little stage of our little triangle's life. It is time to trim it. Because we oversized our triangles that we were using for the print, we have more than a 1/4 inch here extending from the points of our background triangle in the middle. And we did that because fabric can be fussy. And I'm a believer in oversizing things and trimming them just slightly so that they're perfect. If you would rather not have to do this step and you are super confident in your piecing skills, then you can cut these 3 print squares to the same size as that background square, which for the 12-inch size was 4 1/4 instead of 4 3/4. Hopefully it'll work for you. I'd rather trim. So to trim, what we're going to do is I'm going to use a square ruler, and this really is easier with a square ruler. If you only have a straight ruler, then you're going to have to kind of cut one side, flip it, and cut the other side, which will totally work. But if you have a square ruler, use it here. Now, my ruler, this is a Creative Grids ruler, it has this kind of frosted edge, which denotes the 1/4 inch line. And this is super helpful for trimming because that is your seam allowance, right? So I am going to align that 1/4 inch with the tips of our background triangle. And then I am going to use the square lines to make sure that the right angle of the background triangle is square. So perfect. And now there's just 2 more pieces of fabric to add. We are going to add our outer triangles to form our kind of side elaborate flying goose unit. Now again, these are oversized. I am going to align them, just giving myself a little bit of a hair of room on this side, and then letting most of the excess length of the triangle hang off on the top. Now, doing this is just going to give me a little bit of insurance. Have you ever pressed open a half square triangle or a flying goose corner and it kind of bows in and you don't have all the height or length that you need from that outer triangle? Overhanging it just a little bit here will kind of give a little bit more room, so that if you had a little bit of trouble with your piecing, you will have a little bit of insurance length in your side triangle. So I'm going to sew this seam, and if you see here, this is the point of our center triangle. You can see the seam is here, and this is our other stitch line. So when I am stitching along, I am going to fudge if necessary to get my needle to come and hit just to the inside of that point. I want to stitch like right here. I don't want to stitch on the point because I still have to open up this seam, and that is going to take a little bit of width to do because fabric isn't infinitely thin. So I want to give myself just a couple of threads of ease there so that when I open it up, my point is nice and pointy. And again, there's a lot of fabric on this side and none on this side. So I am going to press out towards this big triangle. Ta-da! And now we repeat that on the other side. And again, I'm giving myself a sliver of the background showing kind of off the bottom, and then letting the majority of the extra kind of come off the top. Our side unit is finally just about done. We have one more thing to do, and that's to trim it up just a little bit. Trimming flying geese like units is never particularly fun because there's all these angles that you need to worry about and preserving points. So here's how I do these. First, we're going to establish a straight line across the side of the block. And what we're going to do is put our ruler down, and I am going to line up this 1/4 of an inch line with the bottom point of our center triangle. And then I am going to double check and make sure that the top of this triangle is straight by making sure that it aligns with a line on the ruler or between two parallel lines on the ruler. You just want to make sure that your ruler is straight and not like off to the side a little bit. See, the point still matches up, but it's not square. You can also use, if you have a diagonal line on your ruler, you can match that up to your seam. And if it's not straight, then just kind of pick a happy place in between all those things. But this point is the most important thing. So I'm going to trim that off. And I'm not trimming off a lot here. So now we are going to flip this over, and to fit into our block, this side piece needs to be 3.5 inches high. So now that we have a nice straight line established on this side, we are just going to move over 3.5 inches, and our 1/4 of an inch line should match up with the top point of our big center flying goose triangle here, straight as I can make it. And trim. Now it's 3.5 inches high. We need to make sure that it is 6.5 inches in length. Now when we pieced these outer triangles here, we gave ourselves a little bit of wiggle room. When we overlapped them, you could see that little slice of that outer triangle when we were piecing them. And what that created is this little bit of extra length. So the angle of this interior triangle comes down, and there's that about 1/8 of an inch on either side. It's just a little bit of wiggle room in case your piecing wasn't perfect. This gives you a little option to be able to extend it and still have enough seam allowance when you're sewing your block together. So the first step is to take your ruler and measure from the diagonal seam over to the diagonal seam and see if it's 6.5 inches. And if it is, then awesome. Your piecing was great, and your diagonal lines from your large triangle are going to come right down to that corner. So I'm looking, and mine is about 1/8 of an inch short. So I'm glad that I had that little bit of extra width with those triangles on the side so that I can trim just a hair outside and have enough width in this unit. So this is my 6.5 inch line, starting from this corner over, this is 6.5 inches. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of center that 6.5 inches so that there's like a 32nd of an inch of background sticking out over here and like a 32nd on the other side. It's not a lot, but it will just help your block look as good as it can be. So I'm making sure I'm straight across the cut line on the bottom and my large triangle is centered on that 6.5 inches. And now I'm going to cut off the excess over here. And now if we flip it around and put it at 6.5 inches, so I'm aligning this with 6.5 inches on the ruler and then this on any straight line. And we have an almost perfect 3.5 by 6.5 inch side unit. Almost perfect because there is just that little tiny bit of extra white on the sides, but that allows us to have enough fabric in the seam allowance when we're sewing this block together. And that's what it's time to do now. I have all the pieces for my block here ready to sew together. We have 4 of our side units. We have our center square. Circle gets the square. And we have 4 half square triangles that are already trimmed and ready to go. And now it's just sewing it together like you would any 9 patch. I'm going to sew these together, these together, these together, and then add these to the row and then sew the rows together. Easy as pie. All done. I think this turned out super cute. It is pretty darn perfect. My points really came out, and that's really thanks to all of that trimming. I know that trimming isn't everyone's favorite, but it really does make a big difference in your final block. Everything just fits together, just perfect. The instructions for how many blocks you need to make a whole quilt are in the free PDF download, which is in the description below. If you liked this video, then there are other videos in this series, and a playlist for them will be popping up on the screen right now, along with another video that YouTube thinks that you will love. Have a fantastic week, and I will see you guys again next time. Happy quilting! These aren't even close to 4 inches. I don't know what I was thinking when I cut these.